is one moment in history that is wildly significant, even though most people don't realize it. Story 1. In ancient Greece, the Pythagoreans were a secret religious society who kept their discoveries mathematical and otherwise to themselves. Then one of their members publicized their teachings, earning their wrath. I think he got expelled or sentenced to death or something. This was a huge momentous thing, because unlike in Egypt or Persia where the astronomers and scientists closely guarded their secrets, it ushered in a new age where people shared their scientific or mathematical findings with the world, accelerating intellectual progress. I read this in a book years ago, so it may not be completely accurate, but that's what I remember. It was Hippasus, the man credited with the discovery of irrational numbers. As legend says, despite his many contributions, Hippasus is also remembered for his death. According to legend, he was cast into the sea by the Pythagoreans because he revealed their secret teachings to the outside world. This was seen as a betrayal of the Pythagorean way of life and was considered a serious offense. Story 2. Facebook started the events feature in 2005 and groups feature in October 2010. In December 2010, Tunisia overthrew its government and revolution spread through the Arab world. Egypt, Libya, Syria all organized through 2 features on Facebook. Story 3. Stanislav Petrov choosing to ignore an alarm that indicated that the US had fired 5 missiles towards Moscow. He disobeyed military orders and saved the world from nuclear war in 1983. Story 4. The Chicago Tylenol murders. 1982. Someone was switching the medicine inside the capsules with poison, and putting it back on the shelf for people to purchase and use. 7 deaths, a few copycat instances as well. This completely changed world culture, package safety, and anti-tampering measures regarding medicine, food and practically any substance you put in or on your body. Story 5. I'm guessing Adobe Flash shutting down. It got rid of all the childhood media we had, not to mention Adobe Flash itself. It played an extremely important role in the early days of the internet. It was used for interactive web pages, advertising, animated videos, e.g. Homestar Runner, Happy Tree Friends and video games, e.g. Club Penguin, the world's hardest game. Story 6. When Lucille Ball saved Star Trek. It was set to be cancelled after the very first season, but she bought the rights and started shooting at Desilu Studios. Star Trek gave us automatic doors and cell phones and the first televised interracial kiss, and that franchise is still busting down barriers to this day and inspiring the new science minds of tomorrow. I am a Jedi, like my mother before me, but those Federation nerds got my respect. Story 7. The 99-day reign of Frederick III of Prussia. World War I and everything after may never have happened if had not been fatally ill when he ascended the throne. Story 8. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet sub near Cuba was being depth-charged by the U.S. Navy, cut off from communication and overheating. The captain thought WWII had started and wanted to launch a nuclear torpedo. Protocol required agreement from 3 officers. 2 said yes, 1 man Vasily Arkhipov said no. He stopped the launch, surfaced the sub, and likely prevented nuclear war. The guy literally saved the world and most people have never heard of him. Story 9. How close the 2008 crash came to actually fully crashing the market. Like full-on worse than the crash of the Great Depression. If I remember, it came down to several hours. Story 10. The invention of the Haber-Bosch process early 20th century for synthesizing ammonia. This allowed mass fertilizer production, dramatically boosting food supply. It's estimated this process supports roughly half the world's population today. An immense, unheralded moment making modern life possible for billions. Story 11. The Bretton Woods Conference. In 1944, some 730 delegates from all 44 Allied nations came together at a large hotel in New Hampshire to outlaw practices which are agreed to be harmful to the world prosperity. And so the international banking system was established, IMF was created, all currencies were required to be convertible for trade, and exchange rates were modified so that one nation would not be favored over another. All these actions led to the development of the World Bank. Downside, the whole world's economy got teetered together forever, whereby one lunatic president's for tariff war, or to be more precise ego war, can lead to the whole world's economy going down the drain. Story 12. The Battle of Jumonville Glen in 1754, where 22-year-old George Washington first tasted battle leading 50 colonials and Allied natives against 30 French soldiers in a backwoods part of Pennsylvania beyond the Appalachian Mountains that were the nominal border between British and French colonial territory in the New World. This small engagement kicked off the French and Indian War, which immediately led to the 7 Years' War, which later led to the American War of Independence, which seriously influenced the French Revolution, which gave rise to Napoleon, who broke Germany among other feats, making way for the later unification of Germany, which set most of the groundwork for World War I, which directly led to World War I and the Cold War that later followed it, which directly leads us to the modern state of the world. Washington's actions on that day have had direct effects that continue on to the present day, all because of a 15-minute fight between less than 90 men in an empty corner of southwestern Pennsylvania. The world today is the way it is. Story 13. Jerry Ryan getting cast as 7 of 9 on Star Trek Voyager. Her character is popular. Her role is extended. She has to live in Los Angeles, straining her marriage with the up-and-coming Republican politician Jack Ryan in Illinois. They divorce in 1999. In 2004, Jack Ryan is running for the Illinois Senate seat already held by retiring Republican, Peter Fitzgerald. A judge decides to release the records of Ryan's divorce, which reveal that Head repeatedly asked his then-wife Jerry Ryan to perform public acts with him at BDSM clubs in multiple cities in the mid-90s. Ryan withdraws his candidacy for Senate over the scandal because optics mattered back then, and his opponent, a little-known Democrat named Barack Obama, is waved into the Senate unopposed. The rest is history. Obama goes on a meteoric rise as the senator from Illinois, culminating in being elected president just 4 years later, not only becoming the first black president in U.S. history, but defeating the very popular Republican John McCain, who almost certainly would have defeated any other opponent whatsoever. So the reason that Obama was president from 2008 to 2016 is because Jerry Ryan was cast as the cool Borg lady in a leotard on Star Trek Voyager in the 90s. Story 14. I think a lot about how Hillary Clinton possibly could have won the 2016 election if an investigation into her emails wasn't opened up again because someone named Wiener couldn't stop sending sick pics. Story 15. People seem to forget the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004 when listing the most significant events of the 21st century. It's right up there with 9/11, COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Story 16. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II, Alex III, who is a radical conservative, succeeds him, blames the Jews for the death, and enacts the May Laws in the early 1880s. 2 to 3 million Jews emigrate from the Pale of the Settlement due to oppression. Most go to the US, but hundreds of thousands go to Germany. This influx of migrants upsets Germans, setting the stage for the Holocaust. It's also the beginning of applied Zionism and the earnest movement of Jews to Israel, giving us what we have today: no assassination, no Holocaust, no Israel-Palestine conflict. Story 17. Eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. It caused volcanic winter in parts of Europe with food shortages and famine. Scared aristocrats were barred in their manners and were entertaining each other with stories. Thanks to them we have Frankenstein and Dracula. Horses moved from transport to food category, and people were forced to find other means of transportation and invented velocipede. People who starved in that time invented fertilizers that allow food to grow in horrible conditions. Story 18. There was a day in deep dark history when someone had the idea of turning our spoken words into drawn symbols on possibly clay or rock. We don't know who or when this happened, but it was the day that literacy was born. Story 19. Henry Ford mass-producing cars with internal combustion engines. Cars have dramatically changed the physical landscape, replaced rail as the primary means of mass travel, led to proliferation of the paved streets and highways, parking lots, gas stations, motels and fast food outlets. Contributed to congestion, urban sprawl, air pollution and climate change. Demand for oil influenced geopolitics for 100 years. Story 20. Trump's win this election. This was the most important election in over 100 years, and almost no one realized it. I feel sorry for this nation's future. We had one chance to stop it, and no one even recognized the danger. It's stupid, and I really hate mass ignorance. It's so harmful. It'll take 50 to 100 years to fix what's happening now and what may happen over the next few years. Nothing will be the same. Everything will be worse than it should have been for very literally every single person alive right now. Your future is now worse, period, forever, until the day you die. Most folks will never comprehend this reality, and that's disheartening. It means many will never even learn from it and simply assume this is normal. It is not. This is worse, vastly worse, and there's nothing I personally can do about it. Story 21. Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. It was a pivotal event resulting in the end of Roman expansion into Northern Europe, ending at the Rhine, thus leading to the culture clash that continues between Southern and Northern Europe that continues to this day, and has led to so many other conflicts such as the Reformation and the 30 Years' War. Story 22. Pascal and Fermat discovering probability theory in the 17th century. Without it you don't have risk-based insurance, and without that you don't have capitalism for good or ill. A mathematical model for probabilities that made insurance a reasonable financial proposition instead of the guessing game it had been, thereby making it possible to underwrite larger and more complex ventures. H.T. Upraziatko. Story 23. They're eating the dogs. Presidential debate reasons why this is a significant one. Trump showed how easily he could be manipulated by someone else too. He is incapable of telling fact from fiction. 3. He was willing to demonize an entire group of people for his own political gain. 4. More than half the country still voted for him. What the? Story 24. Obama deciding to request only $800 billion stimulus from Congress in Jan-February 2009. He was over 70 approval, a large electoral mandate, and the economy was cratering. The actual economic math said it needed at least $1.2 trillion in stimulus, but Rahm Emanuel just decided Congress wouldn't go for something in the trillion range, so they trimmed back the ask for the most trivial reasons. Apparently they wouldn't even let any of his economic advisors even present the $1.2 option to Obama. Rahm and Summers made the $800 billion option the bigger of what they offered Obama. But then, Obama picked these people, so it's still on him. 2. Small stimulus anemic recovery. 2010 midterm blowout Republican gerrymander numerous states like WI, MI and P. Obama's congressional agenda is dead. Dems lose Senate in 2014. Obama can't replace Scalia. Roe overturned. The cascade from this one terrible decision at the start of his presidency at a historic hinge point moment continues to this day. Story 25. At some point in her life, Queen Victoria of England spontaneously mutated one of her genes on her X chromosome. As a woman, she had a redundant copy in the other gene, and so she had no physical effects. However, she passed this mutation on to her descendants all across European royal families. Males who received the mutation suffered from hemophilia. Her grandson Alexei, the son of the Tsar of Russia, was one of these. In despair, her mother turned to the monk Rasputin, who seemed to be able to help his symptoms. Over time, he gained more and more influence over the royal family, ultimately becoming the power behind the throne. This enraged the Russian people and led to the communists successfully leading a revolution and establishing the USSR. All through the 20th century, the US and USSR waged a Cold War, with many proxy wars being waged in their behalf. One of these was in Afghanistan, where the US armed and propped up the Taliban, who were fighting the Soviets. Later, the Taliban were patrons to al-Qaeda, providing a base from which they plotted and carried out the attacks of 9/11, easily the most consequential single genetic mutation in history. Story 26. The Broad Street cholera outbreak of 1854. The local doctor was convinced the disease was in the water. He had the handle of the water pump removed. Cases dropped dramatically. This started two things: scientific investigation of disease outbreaks and microbiology. Something like that anyway. Story 27. Maybe not wildly significant, but pretty significant. When a search plane on a Japanese aircraft carrier had a mechanical problem during the Battle of Midway, that search plane ended up being the one that found an American carrier, but because of the mechanical failure it launched late. Because it launched late it found the Americans late. Because it found the Americans late, a decision made by Japanese leaders some minutes earlier had to be reversed. Because that decision had to be reversed and an information came late, the Japanese carriers weren't able to launch an attack on the Americans but were instead caught completely unprepared when American planes attacked. For want of a working search plane, the Japanese suffered a huge loss and never had a reasonable chance of winning the war afterwards. Story 28. The Siege of Sijitvar. Basically, Suleiman the Magnificent was on the warpath into Europe with an army of 50 to 100k Ottomans. They had to deal with the fortress of Sijitvar first to make sure they didn't get flanked later. The fortress only had around 2 to 3k soldiers manning it. They managed to cause 20 to 30k casualties over the span of a month holding out against the Ottomans, during which Suleiman died and the fortress was lost, but it knocked the wind out of the Ottoman sails and they went back east. This battle and the 3,000 Hungarians and Croatians are considered by some historians to have saved Western civilization. Story 29. The Compromise of 1877. Rich white male politicians played with the newly given rights of black citizens in the U.S. in a political game. Minorities have always been pawns to them, but this event showed just how little white men in positions of power care about the rights of people of color. We fought the Civil War. Many died to free the slaves. Once the war was over, the Reconstruction era began in the South. For the first time in American history, black citizens began to be able to exercise their newly given rights, but were only able to do so freely under the careful watch and safety of the National Guard, due to hateful white people still wanting to harm black people post-Civil War. At the time, presidential elections used to be a candidate from the North and a candidate from the South. The North lost the presidential election, and in a political game, the South bargained to give the presidency to the North in exchange for the withdrawal of the National Guard and effectively, the end of black citizens' ability to exist freely and fairly in the South. The North accepted, gaining the presidency but handing over black citizens' freedoms right back to the enemy we had just fought a civil war against. The Reconstruction era ended. Many lives were lost to give black people freedom, many fights were fought, and yet less than 13 years later, all that was gained was given back so quickly in a political game. You can see how this theme echoes throughout history before and after. This disregard for the rights of black citizens in the face of a political game continues to this day. This would directly lead to the rise of the KKK and other terrorist hate groups, would lead to segregation, the war on drugs, and so much more that still goes on today. Most rich white male politicians do not care about the lives of others if they are able to profit off their misery somehow. We are all pawns, especially the people without privilege, and the system is inherently against minorities. Edit. Knowing all this, you can see why some hateful white people want to ban critical race theory. A lot of hateful white people don't want you to know like this, that the system that they built is inherently against anyone non-white, non-cishet, non-male, and it still is. Story 30. Just my opinion, but the battles of Kokkin Gol between the Soviet Union and the Empire of Japan in 1939, the Japanese tried to invade Mongolia but were decisively pushed back by the Soviets and they never engaged with them again. I think this is hugely impactful because of what happened in 1941. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Hitler didn't have any reason to declare war on the US. But he did. I think Hitler did it hoping it would inspire Japan to also declare war on the USSR and force them to fight a two-front war, taking some pressure off the German invaders. Unfortunately for Adolf, I think Japan had quietly decided after Kokkin Gol that fighting the Soviets was something best to be avoided. If Hitler had known that, maybe he doesn't declare war on the US and we just focus on fighting the Japanese and leave Europe to the Europeans. Maybe the Nazis don't succeed in taking Russia, but also maybe Germany doesn't get completely defeated and occupied without the massive economic and manufacturing power the US applies to the European theater. Story 31. The Suez Crisis of 1956. It doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves outside of history nerd circles, but it was basically the moment the UK and France officially lost their status as global superpowers, and the US cemented itself as the dominant Western force. Quick recap: Egypt's President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been controlled by British and French interests. In response, the UK, France, and Israel launched a secret military operation to take it back. They figured the US would back them or at least look the other way. Spoiler: the US did not. Eisenhower was furious they acted without consulting him, and he saw it as colonial overreach during the Cold War, so he used the full weight of American economic power to shut them down, threatened to tank the British pound if they didn't back off. Why it's significant: this was the geopolitical gut punch that showed the old European empires their time was up. From that point on, the US and the USSR were the only true superpowers. It also pushed a lot of former colonies further toward independence and gave a big boost to non-aligned movements. It wasn't a huge war like World War II or Vietnam, but in terms of long-term impact on global power structures, absolutely massive. Most people have no idea. Story 32: The Failure of Reconstruction and Capitulation by Andrew Johnson to the Dixiecrats after Lincoln's assassination. When I think about what could have been in this country, it makes me want to scream. Story 33: I feel like the internal combustion engine does not get enough love. It actually shapes the infrastructure of modern cities, or what academics like to call the built environment. It also helped lift a lot of people from poverty back in the day in the Western world because it was linked to many industries that provided much-needed jobs. Even today it's doing the same in some African and Asian countries. Story 34: The Invention of the Mechanical Clock and the Invention of the Pendulum Clock 350 years later. Seeing how much a lot of our systems now rely on accurate timekeeping and all the discoveries and inventions that were made because we kept creating more and more accurate timekeepers, this was massive breakthrough. Story 35: I don't know if I'd call it a moment, but the year 536 AD, otherwise known as the worst year in history, 3 volcanic events happened around the same time that caused a volcanic winter. Temperatures dropped, crops failed, livestock died, and people starved to death across a large portion of the world. It had devastating consequences that lasted for years. It was one of the causes of the plague of Justinian and the fall of the Roman Empire. Millions of people were killed across the world, in a time when populations are nowhere near what they are today. Story 36: While studying Staphylococcus bacteria, Dr. Alexander Fleming noticed that a mold contaminating one of his petri dishes had created a bacteria-free zone around itself. He identified a substance in the mold that he called penicillin, which inhibited bacterial growth. Penicillin's introduction likely prevented perhaps as many as 500 million deaths, making it one of the most life-saving medical advances in history. Story 37: The Battle of the Metaurus 207 BC. Hasdrubal Barca, brother of Hannibal, was on his way to reinforce him in Italy. He was defeated in this battle, which led to the decline of Carthage and secured the ascendancy of Rome. Story 38: The destruction of the Institute of Research by the Nazis in Berlin in 1933. Magnus Hirschfeld, one of the earliest sexologists, was doing pioneering work there, including the first successful gender affirmation surgeries for trans women. When his institute was sacked by the Nazis, all his books and research were systematically burned. It set transgender healthcare back about a century according to some estimates. One of Hermann Kort's rival conquistadors was a guy called Panfilo de Narvaez. He turned up in Veracruz in 1520 with an African slave on board his ship, named Francisco Egua. Egua had smallpox and seems to be the first recorded case of the disease in the Americas. The entire history of the Columbian exchange, colonialism, and the New World would have been drastically different if that infection had never taken hold. I guess it was inevitable that someone would have brought smallpox to the Americas, but the people who did are mostly forgotten to history. Story 39: The Tampa Crisis in Australia. John Howard's We Will Decide Who Comes to This Country and the Way in Which They Come has impacted Australian politics for the last 20 years, and has influenced immigration policy all over the world, and not in a good way. John Howard and His Cruel Policies. 2016 U.S. Presidential Election. Story 40: Princip encountering Archduke Ferdinand by chance 45 minutes after Ferdinand survived the first assassination attempt, and Princip completed the assassination. WW1 was likely to occur eventually anyway, but it started this way that day, and it ushered in the Treaty of Versailles, a wounded but alive Adolf Hitler. Story 41: In San Francisco in 1906 they had a massive earthquake, probably one of the most devastating to occur in the United States. In the immediate aftermath, the president of a small regional bank, known as the Bank of Italy, immediately took all of the money out of its vaults and walked down the streets handing out loans to people so that they could rebuild. They were one of the first banks to start lending money during the Reconstruction. This bank was founded specifically on the principle of handing out personal loans to workers, the low and middle class, rather than simply the upper class, most notably to Italian immigrants and settlers, hence the name. The Bank of Italy would later merge with a smaller bank known as Bank of America, Los Angeles. The two banks would become what is today Bank of America. Story 42: World War I, which led to World War II, which led to the Cold War, which led to basically the modern world as we know it. One bullet set off a chain reaction that reshaped the entire 20th century. Story 43: Winston Churchill, before WW2, was head of the British Navy, at the time by far the largest admiralty in the world, and spread over the empire. He took the decision to change all the ships from coal-powered to oil-powered, which meant there was suddenly a need for oil and stations all over the world, starting a ball rolling that's knock-on effect is obvious today. Story 44: The Fourth Crusade. The Byzantine Empire was still moderately strong back then, able to hold its own against the Turks, but rife with internal struggle. If the betrayal at Constantinople and the sack of the city never happened, the empire might have survived for far longer, perhaps even until modern days. The Ottomans would never have risen, and their empire never would have existed. The Balkan nations, Hungary and Romania would have remained independent, or at least under the control of other Christians. The Habsburgs and the Polish would have had far different interests. The Armenian and Greek genocides would never have happened, and the border between Europe and Asia, Christianity and Islam would be somewhere in Anatolia, not at the modern Greek-Turkish border. Story 45: How lucky America was that the USS Vestal survived Pearl Harbor. The Vestal was a repair ship that went on to repair major ships during the Pacific War such as the Saratoga, South Dakota, and the Enterprise. Story 46: The Battle of Milvian Bridge in Ancient Rome 312 AD solidified Constantine's faith in Christianity and led to his deathbed conversion that sparked a Christian revolution that led to the world as we know it today. Interesting battle actually. Maxentius had essentially taken over Rome, so good. Old Constantine led an army back there to retake it. Maxentius had the Milvian Bridge rigged with some removable bolts that were to be yanked at the right time, causing Constantine's army to plunge into the Tiber. Meanwhile, Constantine was being advised on the down low by some bishops, which was a bit of a controversial thing in pagan Roman times, and they convinced him to have the first two letters of Christ's name painted on his army's shields equivalent to have a cross painted on it midway through the clash. Some numpty on Maxentius' side pulled the bolts too early, and most of Maxentius' army fell into the river, gifting Constantine the win. Of course, this was clearly a sign from God himself and led to a softening of the anti-Christian laws and the eventual conversion of Rome's fabled emperor on his deathbed. So those bolts in that bridge, well, those relatively small items caused the surge one of the biggest religions the globe has ever seen and sparked an entire religious and cultural revolution that still has a huge part to play in everyone's lives one way or another. And it's really not a battle that many people talk about. The bolts in the bridge story is, as a lot of ancient history, just one interpretation of how the events unfolded, but it's one I personally like as a cool story. Story 47: During the Cold War in 1962, off the coast of Cuba, the U.S. dropped depth charges into the ocean near a Russian submarine. The crew of the submarine, unable to know for sure what the charges were, started to believe that the Cold War had escalated into all-out war. They were armed with nuclear weapons and in the event of war, were expected to use them. To deploy their nuclear weapons, the consent of 3 certain officers aboard the sub was required. 2 of them agreed to launch the nukes, but the 3rd officer, Vasily Arkhipov, decided not to do it, as they couldn't be certain war had broken out. Without his agreement, they couldn't launch the nukes. They surfaced, realized war hadn't broken out, and the world kept spinning. Had they launched, the US likely would have launched nukes in response, and things would have just escalated. By not being quick to violence, Vasily Arkhipov probably saved the world that day. This is a rushed version of the story. I don't remember all the details, but I've always thought it to be an unbelievable high-stakes moment in history. It's wild to think about. Sorry, it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, not the Cold War. Story 48: A game developer decided to post a long blog filled with untrue accusations that evolved into harassment campaigns against women. However, it's more than that. Gamersgate changed the political landscape to what it is today. The 2000 presidential election. If Gore just carries his home state of Tennessee, he wins the presidency outright. The last 25 years would have been very different. Story 49: Money and Politics. Citizens United vs. FEC 2010. The Supreme Court ruled that corporations and unions have a First Amendment right to spend unlimited money on political advocacy, as long as it is independent of campaigns, i.e., not directly coordinated with candidates. Speech Now, Org v. FEC 2010, same year, in a lower court case. U.S. Court of Appeals for D.C., this ruling established that contributions to independent political action committees PACs can be unlimited. Story 50: The Victoria Hall Disaster in Sunderland, England 1883. A kids' variety show was on at the Victoria Hall in Sunderland and was available to rich and poor. One of the big sellers of the show was that presents would be handed out. Problem is the show's actors were only capable of throwing them into the crowd directly in front of the stage. The kids up in the higher tier seats realized they were going to miss out, so they surged down to the lower level. Other major problem is the door to the lower level was stuck so that only one person could pass through to manage ticket dodgers. The doors could only be pulled open from the children's side, which caused a massive crush resulting in the deaths of 183 children. The news of the tragedy spread worldwide, and it is the reason why we have very specific laws on emergency exits and doors pushing outwards of buildings instead of inwards to this day. Story 51: The Fraud That Ruined the World. Story 52: The Murder-Suicide. The Mayerling incident committed by Austria's Prince Rudolf. If not for this, he would have become emperor. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand wouldn't have been the spark to kick off World War I, thus preventing Hitler's rise to power after Austria lost. Story 53: Magna Carta and all the subsequent treaties that recognized human rights. The amount of ignorant people that don't realize how important those rights and principles are is astonishing. also the way they are willing to renounce or deny this rights because it gets in the way of their beliefs. Story 54: The invention of the humble shipping container. Maybe not a moment per se, but definitely an event. Nothing flashy, but its impact is immense. Just try to imagine global trade today without standardized shipping containers. They completely revolutionized trade, making it faster, safer, and cheaper. Every item you see around you, chances are it arrived in your country in a shipping container. It's easy to take for granted now, but this system increased the efficiency of transport and reduced costs dramatically, effectively enabling globalization as we know it today. Story 55: The White Ship disaster had a big impact on England. November 1120, on a trip from France to England, from the harbor of Barfla the ship sank. Many members of English Norman nobility died, approximately 300 people, including the heir to the English throne. This then caused a succession crisis in England, with Empress Matilda being named heir. However, on Henry I's death his nephew Stephen seized the throne, causing a civil war known as the Anarchy 1135 to 1153. Big part of early English history, just a generation after William the Conqueror, had a large political impact on the country, and it's not widely known about. Story 56: Some servant of a Sumerian king complained that he was too tired to remember all that the king wanted him to do, so the king, in his frustration, made etchings in clay to help, first writing. Story 57: Scipio Africanus setting out on a campaign to defeat the Carthaginians, ultimately culminating with his victory over Hannibal Barca at the Battle of Zama. If Scipio had not defeated Hannibal, the Roman Empire probably would have never existed, and the rise and fall of the Roman Empire is by far the most influential series of events in European history, even up until today. Whether it's very obvious today or not, most of the major events in European history have revolved around attempts to re-establish the Roman Empire, fighting over who has the right to re-establish the Roman Empire, resistance to people attempting to re-establish the Roman Empire, and fighting over the legacy of the Roman Empire. If Hannibal had succeeded in conquering Rome, which he nearly did, then the history of Europe could have been dominated by an empire of Phoenicians based out of North Africa, and the legacy of whatever might have come after that. Story 58: Not really a moment, but I'm gonna go with the invention of steam power. No, not the company that made Half-Life, though that was cool, but actual steam power, ships, locomotives, steam engines. Prior to that, there was only human and animal muscle if you wanted to move something, or lift something, or make something. After steam engines were invented, there was this sort of revolution, an industrial revolution. Not only that, but the scientific community trying to figure out just how and why steam engines were so effective led to things like the laws of thermodynamics and eventually the discovery of the atom. Story 59: Well, for Americans, the basis of free refills for us. Pepsi bought Taco Bell in 1978. In the mid-80s, Pepsi wasn't doing so well. They came up with a new marketing campaign, free refills on their sodas, Pepsi products. It was a hit. Such a hit they kept lengthening the promotion until they knew they just had to keep it, and then other fast food chains started to copy them, to keep up, and now almost every place we eat has free refills and no one really knows why, but now you do. Story 60: Repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, cleared the way for partisan doctrine, amplified ideological echo chambers, contributed to political polarization, birth of infotainment. Story 61: Germans during World War I deciding to fund some Russian dudes to undermine Russian Empire, eventually establishing first communist state and spreading of communism. Story 62: Enrico Dandolo was a leader of Venice. He funded a crusade and basically the Crusaders paid him off by giving him Constantinople. This significantly weakened the Byzantine Empire, which led to the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which became the preeminent world power for 400 years, give or take. Story 63: Moving away from the gold standard. It provided firm discipline for governance. Without it, money has been printed, bonds issued to cover it. Now America is addicted to debt. Story 64: The Battle of Warsaw, specifically the one in 1920. There's been a few, is very little known in most countries, but it can be and has historically been argued as the moment that Bolshevik communism failed in its march to the West. Following the dissolution of the three empires that had occupied their countries, the Poles were attempting to create an entire new country from whole cloth, out of what had been three countries, while also attempting to smooth out disputes between Poles and various ethnic minorities they lived alongside. It was only very shortly after, in 1919, that the veteran Bolshevik Red Army invaded, intending to topple Poland and incorporate it into their new communist state and then use Poland as a launching point to take Germany. The war had been going poorly for Poland, their leaders being a rainbow coalition of opposing ideologies, their army being poorly equipped with the leftovers of three separate armies, and their leaders needing to convince soldiers during the war that Poland was a nation that actually exists. At the same time, however, political machinations by Stalin and interpersonal disputes amongst Red Army leaders created an opportunity for a potential breakthrough that was so unlikely. The Soviets had actually intercepted the plans, but dismissed them as obviously false and an amateurish attempt at subversion by Polish intelligence. The Polish did go on to succeed in that war, eventually pushing the Bolsheviks out of their country afterwards, and finally creating that nation they had wanted. If they had failed in Warsaw, it is generally accepted the new Polish Republic would have inevitably dissolved, and upon reaching the German border, the Red Army would begin organizing with German communist groups for a joint attack to topple that country, and who knows what else from there. Story 65 The Great Lisbon Earthquake of 1755. In short, Lisbon was a very holy city and they were celebrating All Saints' Day, when a massive earthquake devastated the city. The event shook all of Europe's preconceptions about nature and a benevolent God to its core. Many people point to this event as the epical event of the Enlightenment. It marked the turning point of when we stopped thinking about such natural disasters as acts of God, and started looking for other scientific explanations for them. Story 66 The founding of News Ltd in 1922, by a cabal of Australian oligarchs, specifically to make propaganda to advance their interests, shortly after they hired Keith Murdoch, whose son Rupert Murdoch inherited control of it in 1952. The destruction of U.S. democracy via Fox News follows that of the British welfare state, the pillaging of Australia's commonwealth by resources companies, and the prevention of any meaningful action on climate change. No single organization has done more harm to democracy. Story 67 This is specific to the U.S. In the late 80s, the FCC abolished the fairness doctrine which required news outlets to present opinions across the political spectrum, in the interest of the public, and now we have channels like Fox News poisoning people's minds and political echo chambers. It gave rise to radio personalities like Rush Limbaugh, and it's only gone downhill since then.